Welcome back. This is Jordyn Laird, my cousin, and she just finished her thesis defense for her undergraduate degree in psychology. Jordyn is studying psychopathy mainly, I believe, and some other elements related to it. So maybe why don't we just start by you talking a little bit about your thesis and what exactly it was on, and
hmm
then we'll go from there.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, like you said, I've taken an interest in forensic psychology, specifically in psychopathy, but also in racial issues regarding criminal psychology. And so my thesis defense, it was on um, the impact of race in people's judgments about criminal behavior.
Mm.
So what we did is we had a case study which depicted a rape and a murder scenario, and we had 9 different variations of the case study, um, and we manipulated the race of the perpetrator and the race of the victim. So we had 3 different races for each, hence the 9 different case studies. And
Mhm.
so the 3 different races that we had a Caucasian, African American, and indigenous. And yeah, it was super interesting. It was really fun to do.
Have you gotten the results back from what it is yet?
Yes,
Okay,
we have. Yeah.
that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, maybe could you just talk a little bit about what you found with that? Because I'm really interested to see if there was like, I mean, I guess I would assume that there would be a racial bias against the African American and um, indigenous groups, but um, that's the whole point of science is testing. Like, is this just something that is socially a social narrative, or is this an actual thing that's observed through the data? So I'd wonder what you found in your study.
Yeah. Um, what we found was actually not exactly what we expected to find, which
Hmm.
is, I think, is the most interesting piece of doing any type of research,
Yeah.
when you find something that you're not expecting. And so our study specifically didn't look directly at implicit bias, which was we just inferred implicit bias based on the results that we had. Um,
And that you could do that just because there was enough data in other studies to kind of indicate that there would be an implicit bias through different other race effects.
yeah, it's just
Okay.
one possible explanation for what the data presented.
Okay.
Um, so
So so how would you control for confounding variables in that sense?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's a very good question. Um, well, confounding variables, they work alongside the um, data that we have.
okay.
And so after the data was presented, so after we got the results, you can infer an explanation or an interpretation of what the data gave you. So
Mm,
we weren't exactly looking at implicit bias. Instead, we were looking at judgment. So we're looking at how people make their judgments, and
mm,
we were looking at what the judgments actually said. So in that case, we were able to control for the confounding variables. And after we got the results, we were inferring implicit bias. So we're saying maybe this is a possible explanation for why these results came out the way that they did.
and then other researchers could then take that your experiment and say maybe there's another explanation or maybe that is the right explanation and they would expand on it. But
Yeah.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
That makes
Or
sense.
they could operationalize implicit bias and look directly at implicit bias where we didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was just one of the inferences that you made in your discussion and conclusion section
Yes.
of your paper. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah. So what we found is that um, people in general, when it comes to the race of the perpetrator, they tend to judge um, non-white perpetrators less harshly than white perpetrators,
Really?
which is what we thought was super weird and unexpected. Because you would expect that white perpetrators were going to be judged more harshly than non-white perpetrators.
Yeah. But maybe because of the narrative kind of flipping in the past few years, there's been like a compensatory action where people go the other way or something.
That's
Um,
exactly what we. Um, That's exactly what you suggested. It's called a
Yeah.
sympathetic bias effect.
Hmm.
So all of the news and media surrounding racial issues, like the Black Lives Matter movement or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happening in Canada,
Hmm.
all of those things make people hyper aware of the racial issues, specifically regarding the race of the perpetrator. And
Wow.
because the race of the perpetrator was so overt in our study,
Hmm.
people knew that the race of the perpetrator was being measured. So because of that, they were hyper attentive to it through the entirety of the study.
Okay.
So it's possible that if we were inferring implicit bias, it's possible that participants were manipulating their biases,
Hmm.
um, and becoming aware of them, because then they're no longer implicit,
Hmm.
becoming aware of those biases and manipulating for them so that they don't appear racist or discriminatory. Uh,
Yeah.
and so then that's where we would see the sympathetic bias effect.
That's really interesting. And then I suppose there's a myriad of other, like just in my head, the first few things that come to mind is like, I know that in psychology, especially, but in many sciences, there tends to be a weird bias where most of the samples are from these kind of Western educated areas. And it's like, if we took a sample size from maybe a more working class area, I'm not sure what your sample size was, but I'm assuming it was maybe more educated because that's the groups that you as a university student would probably be associated with. Maybe some of these other groups you would find a more kind of discriminatory bias against the groups, the indigenous and African American groups, and then in the Western one, the compensatory effect. It's just, yeah, I guess it's one of those things where um, you just you can't say 100% what it is, but it is just an observation that you can say this is different
Yeah.
from what we would have expected, and that's enough to prompt some more questions. I think that's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. Our participant group was mostly educated people, just because of convenient sampling, um,
Mm.
which is interesting. But we also did control for that. So we used the DIT, which is the defining issues test, and that
Okay.
studies moral reasoning. And so the idea of adding principled moral reasoning into the study is principled moral reasoning has an inverse relationship with implicit bias. So the more that someone scores on a principled moral reasoning test, the less likely they are to make implicit bias decisions or
and
judgments.
and that was part of the test that you, yeah, I remember. I did the experiment as well,
Right. Yeah.
um as one of the participants, one of the many,
Yeah.
and I was completely um undiscriminatory and awesome and just super,
Of
you
course
know
you were.
yeah, I mean, everyone else is like got their biases, but just, we obviously, like, you don't have a bias, only other people do, right?
Of course. That's how it works. Yeah.
I'm totally kidding, but yeah.
So yeah, that was one of the most interesting, I think. Um, However, we did see the implicit bias too in the
Mm.
race of the victim, which is also interesting. So the race of the victim
But it
was,
went the other way from what you expected.
yeah. So
Ah,
this is well, the race of the victim is exactly what we expected.
that would be predictive of the implicit bias.
Yes, so that is one possible explanation. Yeah.
Okay.
Another possible explanation is personalization. Um, we had like a 67% female uh, participants.
Okay.
So because most of our participants were women, and we only took the data from, um, specifically looking at this area, we only took the data from those of European descent. So we had 67% white females. They're more likely to identify with the white victim. And so they're more likely to make like a harsher sentence because they feel they can identify with that person. So it's almost as if the crime has been done to me.
Okay.
So
So
it's
you've done
possible that that is
empathy
another
effect as
explanation.
well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, However, we saw it in almost all of the data. So
And what
uh,
was your racial breakdown of the people taking the test?
yeah, we actually had a very good racial breakdown. However,
Like
we
representative of proportion with that live within the lower mainland? Is that kind of what you were looking for as your basis? I'm just trying to, maybe for people who don't know,
yeah,
like because there's a number of things, like people might say you want 50% white, 50% black, but that wouldn't be representative of this population. So maybe you would want whatever is representative of this population, right?
Yeah. So we didn't narrow it down to a specific geographical location.
Okay.
So we had specifically a lot of people from Canada and the UK.
Okay.
We had a few people from India, a few from China, a few from
Okay.
South
So you
America.
really got like a sample size of like pretty
Yes.
wide breadth.
Yeah.
Okay.
However, we didn't use a lot of the data. We used specifically people from European descent, and the reason why we chose to do that is because people of European descent tend to not experience implicit bias, where people who are not of the majority group do tend to experience implicit bias from other people.
Okay. In
So
their
we're
day to
only
day.
aware of that. So our data would be skewed, um,
Okay.
because the judgments that they're making would be more principled in a
Now,
way.
now, is that representative just of being a minority within a population, or of being of European descent in general? Like if European people of European descent living in India or Mexico or something, would they also experience, or someplace in Africa, would they also experience implicit bias against them, or would it be a different kind of effect than what you would expect from other minority groups?
Um, that's a good question. Uh, in general, white people around the world don't really experience a lot of implicit bias. However, the more that you are immersed in other people's cultures, the less likely you are to make implicit bias judgments.
So white people who are living in predominantly non-white areas are less biased in terms of implicit racial bias in general, but they're not. There's no significantly statistically significant data to show that they are more biased against just because they live as a minority. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
cool. Yeah, I didn't
And
realize that.
the yeah, yeah, the whole basis of that, it goes back to principled moral reasoning, because the way that principled moral reasoning is developed is through one cognitive development, but that's necessary but not sufficient for perspective taking, and perspective taking is developed through role taking and empathy, and the only way that that develops is if you're immersed within a certain area. And so for that specifically to happen, someone who's immersed in a bunch of different cultures would then make less implicit bias decisions because they've been in a role where they've seen, or been, yeah, what's the word?
Exposed to just
Yes,
more.
exposed to other people.
It's
And so then
interesting.
you're more like a principled moral reasoning decision.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say. I want to get back to the just talking a little bit more about the principled moral reasoning thing, because I think that we should expand on that just for people who are listening. But
Oh,
I
yeah.
just wanted to make one kind of tangent from that. I was just finished an exam in a cognitive neuroscience course, and one of the papers that I read was looking at implicit, or not implicit, but like neurological um, changes in bias between different racial groups, and I think that's a really interesting topic in general, especially nowadays.
Mhm.
But the study looked at uh, Japanese participants and American Caucasian participants, and also Japanese Americans, and then asked them to judge the different um, emotions on other people's faces. And there was some. I don't think it's relevant to get into the specifics of the anatomical changes, but basically there was, you could observe just from brain patterns that people made um, were far better at differentiating between different people and between different emotions of their own race than of the other race. And it went both ways. In this case, actually, the Japanese participants were slightly worse than at judging Caucasian faces than the Caucasians at judging Japanese. But I've read other studies that go the other way. And the Japanese group that lived in America was better at judging both groups. So it kind of fits with what you were saying, in that there's um, more exposure and they're better at kind of noticing people's faces. And also, children under the age of 1 are really good at differentiating different people's faces. And it's just as you get older that you tend to, you know, get more specific to the kinds of faces that you see day to day, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really cool. I'm actually on another research study for this summer, and we're
Mm,
looking specifically at face mapping, which is what your the
kind of
paper
talking
is
about.
talking about.
Yeah.
Um, Face mapping, empathy, and decision making.
Hmm.
Uh, so
But let's talk about the moral reasoning thing, because this whole thing of empathy and moral reasoning is such a fascinating subject. But as someone who's, you know, more like I've done more in the neuroscience side of things, it's just the most abstract part of psychology for me. And it's like it's so useful and interesting, but just how you operationalize it and how you know exactly what you're measuring is just so different. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about this study and or this criterion thing
yeah,
and go
yeah,
from there.
yeah, for sure. Um, Principled moral reasoning is hard to operationalize.
Hmm.
And one of the main reasons why is because um, if you're familiar with Kohlberg, he kind of came up with like this whole moral reasoning and theories before him. But Kohlberg is one of the biggest impacts in moral reasoning and moral development.
Hmm.
Um, and his theory stated that once you reach a certain level of moral development, you stay at that level of moral development. All of your decisions then are made at that development level. But then neo-Kohlbergian theories, they take a different approach, and it's called the additive inclusive model. And
Okay.
so, which is what the DIT, which we used in our study, what they look at specifically. Um, and what the additive inclusive model says is that once you get to a certain level of moral development, where there are six, so once you
And
get to a certain level,
what are the 6 levels? Do you want to just
yeah.
quickly go through
So
them
the
so
first
people know?
two are Yeah, the first two, they kind of group them in twos.
Hmm.
First two is pre-conventional, and then there's conventional, which is the 3 and the 4, where most of the population are in like a 2 or a 3. Most of the
Okay.
population sits there, and then 4, and then 5 and 6 is post-conventional, and very few people get to that level of moral
And how do they define each level? Do you have
development.
like just a basic kind of? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of criteria for each one, but just so people get a sense of the kinds of things they're looking for.
Totally. In a pre-conventional moral development, it would be mostly right and wrong is based on what is presented in society. So mom says that writing on the walls is wrong, so writing on the walls is wrong.
Okay.
But if mom didn't say that writing on the walls were wrong, then writing on the walls would be right. So most of the people who sit in one of two only do what is right because it's against the law. So I'm mad at this person, I want to hurt them, but I'm not going to hurt them because it's against the law. Not because hurting them is wrong, because I'm going to do it because it's against the law.
So where would psychopaths fall? Like in the 1 area typically?
Psychopaths are interesting.
Okay, we'll get back to that later then. We'll
Yeah,
just continue talking about this because that's definitely something that I
yeah,
want to talk
for sure,
about.
for sure. And then 3 and 4, where again most of the population kind of sits,
Hmm.
most of the educated population kind of sits, and again, moral reasoning can be developed through education as well,
Mm.
um, because it gives you more chances to take role taking opportunities. So most of the educated population would sit in like a 3 or a 4.
So according to this model, the educated population is more moral on average than uneducated people,
Yes, based on this model.
but not on all models.
No, there's some the additive inclusive model, which we'll get to after I explain just the conventional and post
Yeah,
conventional. Um,
I just yeah
Kind of goes through that a little bit.
yeah because in my experience, and this is just one person's experience, obviously it doesn't. But I don't know that educated people are always more moral. You know.
I
Anyways,
We actually
so
found that in our study too. So
really
yeah,
okay.
we'll talk about it after.
Yeah.
Um, which is interesting.
We got all these things I have to remember. Okay, bring that up, bring that up. Okay.
I know, there's so many pieces. Yes, so then the conventional is the 3 and the 4, is you know that it's wrong because it is wrong, not because the law says that it's wrong, or not because mom and dad says it's wrong. So you won't hurt somebody because hurting somebody is wrong.
Mhm.
Um, and the 3 and the 4 and the 1 and the 2 and the 5 and the 6, even though they're grouped into sections together, it's just a level at which, so it's like when you have middle class, you have lower middle class and upper middle class type thing. It's just a way of separating kind of the development throughout the process of developing.
Okay, yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, so conventional would state that something is wrong because something is wrong. And then when you get to post-conventional, it's interesting because even though something is wrong, at some points, even though it says that it's wrong, you might have to do the thing that is wrong for it to be right. If that makes sense.
Okay, so sometimes you have to take an action that might be wrong on some level in order to make something happen that needs to happen on a bigger level, and you're just better able to figure out which hierarchy of moral decisions or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So
like you have to fight to save someone or something, like you're willing to die so that you can save something else or something.
Exactly. So, or a really good example of this is in World War II, when people would hide the Jews in their home. They know it was against the law. They know technically it was wrong,
but it was
the right thing to do. So they did
very
it.
Few people get to that level, is what you're saying.
Yes, not very many people get to that level. Also, there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance that happens as well, because people generally want to follow what society wants from them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been grilled into their brain since they were a kid. And so when they feel like they have to do something that's the opposite of what their value system is, which again would be like following the laws, would be a value system.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like they have to go against that, then there's a dissonance that happens cognitively.
This reminds me kind of the, I don't know if you've ever read any like Jonathan Haidt stuff. He talks about like I don't know if he's like considered super academically sound, but I'm pretty sure that he's not like a quack or anything, but he does talk a lot about moral dissonance and how different like conservative and liberal types have different moral kind of compasses. So they're playing on completely different moral fields a lot of times, and in different societies people are too. And so a lot of times that people say this person's wrong or this person's terrible, it's because they're playing in completely different moral spheres. And yeah, he wrote this book called The Righteous Mind that kind of talks about this, like how people are kind of all very sanctimonious and think that they're correct, and then other people who have different morals are just terrible, even though they might, as you said, just be going against whatever the societal thing is because they believe that something else is more important or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay,
yeah,
so
that's really cool.
The additive inclusive model is slightly different, as you were saying, and that there's, in your evidence, you found that some uneducated people are actually more moral. Do you want to talk about the differences of the additive inclusive model and how we found that?
Yeah, for sure. So the additive inclusive model is a neo-Kohlbergian theory. And what that states is even when you get to a certain level of moral development, so you might get to a 3 or a 4 in your development, that is the top of how moral judgments you can make. However, you can still make judgments at a level 2. So depending on the situation that you're in, the level of moral level of moral judgments that you make will differ. So if you're in a situation that you have had tons of role-taking opportunities, you have lots of empathy, lots of passion for that thing of wherever it is that you are, you're more likely to make a more moral judgment in that area. Or if you've been studying that for a long time, then if you're in a new situation where you've never taken any type of role-taking opportunity, you've never experienced empathy in that situation, you're more likely to make a less moral judgment. So a educated person who has never studied the concept of racial issues might make a less moral judgment than someone who um, has never been to university or didn't even finish high school, but potentially lives on the streets and is immersed within um, the concept of racial issues all the time, might make a more moral judgment because
Mm.
they've been immersed within that area. However, moral reasoning also states that you need a certain level of cognitive development to get to a point where you can take perspective taking opportunities. So if you don't have that cognitive development, where a lot of people who sit at the 1 and the 2 don't have the cognitive development to take any type of perspective taking opportunities, or don't have theory of mind, which is someone's experiencing something different than what I'm experiencing, so I have to put myself in those person's shoes to understand what they're experiencing. They don't have that, or they haven't developed that, and so it's close to impossible for them to develop a perspective taking perspective.
So you get when you're looking at it on a population level, you get more of the highly cognitively developed people in educated situations. So rather than saying education causes a higher degree of moral reasoning, it's just highly correlated with it. And that people who are uneducated tend to be on the lower levels of the cognitive development scale.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily that educated people make more moral decisions. It's just that
More
educated
moral.
people tend to. Yeah, I know it's a tongue twister.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
They
tends.
all tend to associate with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Educated people tend to have a higher cognitive development, and their cognitive development tends to continue developing as they go through education.
And yet you can still make low level moral decisions even if you have a high. It's just you're capable of making these higher level moral decisions that you wouldn't have been capable of doing on the lower levels of the development.
Yeah, that's what the additive inclusive model would say.
Okay. So it just accommodates for the fact that there are some highly educated people who are terrible, like psychopaths potentially, and there are some uneducated people who make really deep moral decisions, even
Yeah.
though they might not, have a high education, but they need to be cognitively developed.
Yes. Yes. It's a necessary piece of moral development,
Hmm.
or
That's
principled moral reasoning, moral development.
really
Yeah.
interesting. So,
Yeah.
so you're saying that this additive inclusive model helped your study to demonstrate that there was actually a, I guess, a relationship between like less educated people and higher moral reasoning. I'm really interested now with the background being kind of
That's okay.
settled, what kind of conclusions you could draw from that.
Yeah. Um, Again, the educated, non-educated was inferred based on, so for those people who are listening, I guess, I go to Trinity, or I just graduated from Trinity Western, which is a Christian university. And so a lot of the population that was students at Trinity Western were highly religious. And most of the people who were religious, in which I studied for that, most of the people who were religious in my study were of an educated population, just because I'm at Trinity Western, and so just happened to be that the people who were taking the test were religious and also educated.
And then the people at the other places, you tried to get like not religious so that you could balance for that, or was there a religious bias that you just kind of had as a component of your study?
Mostly as a component, and mostly as a covariate.
A
So
covariate. Okay.
because a covariate is something that could potentially impact your data. So you choose to control for it by measuring it. So principled moral reasoning would also be a covariate
Mm-hmm.
for that reason. And so we chose to put a religiosity scale within the study because we knew that, based on convenience sampling and based on the people who knew me, and based on the fact that my study was coming out of Trinity Western, I was probably going to have a pretty high population that were religious.
Mm-hmm.
So we chose to add that scale in there to control for that. So we weren't necessarily looking for it one way or the other. Granted, we ended up coming up with really interesting results using it. Um, But yes, we weren't exactly looking for it.
Yeah, because like whenever you're doing a study like this, you know, you have all these questions like, oh, this is our question about this particular aspect of moral reasoning. Does it differ between populations? Does it differ between religions? Does it differ between degree to which somebody is religious? Does it differ between race or all these other things? But you can't do a study that measures all those things. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess of a study. So you have to choose one, and there's going to be bias in your study. You just have to acknowledge it. And in your case, you just knew that one of those biases would be the degree of religiosity.
Yes, exactly. And it was something that was able to be controlled.
Yes, that's really important.
Yeah.
Okay. I
Yes.
keep interrupting. I'll let you continue with the
No, that's
explanation.
okay. Oh, these are all good things. I
Yeah.
also don't know what to stop and explain and what to just continue going with. So
Yeah.
you
I
stop
think
me if asking questions works.
I don't know, for me, I'll like, I think explain things that you know for a fact are pretty niche. Like people probably don't know what this is, but if it's not super niche, it's people don't know, they can Google it, right?
True. Google is a good
Yeah.
thing. Yes. Yeah. So what we found is the so going back to kind of the race of the victim,
Mm-hmm.
we had an interaction effect between the race of the perpetrator and the race of the victim. Specifically, we asked participants two questions. We asked if they are found guilty. So now the guilt question is out of the picture. So they
Mm-hmm.
don't have to determine guilt. If the perpetrator is found guilty, how long would you sentence them to from 0 to 25 years? And the second question, if found guilty, so again, the guilt question is out of the picture. Um, how much time would you give them before they're eligible for parole? And so what we found, this is where we saw like the implicit bias potentially. Um,
Manifesting itself.
yes, thank you. Um, is for a white perpetrator and a white victim, for the time before parole, participants on average sentenced them to 22 years in prison. But for every other section, they sentenced them to 14 years.
Wow. So that's a
So,
significant jump.
yeah. Yeah. So we saw the sympathetic bias happening with the non perpetrators, which is why in the non white perpetrators, we didn't see the white victim going up in sentencing.
Hmm.
If that makes sense.
Which is
So
kind of what you would expect. You would expect that a white victim and a minority perpetrator would elicit people giving the harshest sentences just based off of like, I don't know, the last 600 years of freaking sentences
yeah,
for those situations. But that's really interesting that the sympathy bias seemed to almost flip the narrative, or
yeah,
actually flip the narrative. Not almost, it literally
yes,
did.
yeah, yeah. But because for the white perpetrator, they didn't have to do any type of manipulation of their biases, we
Hmm.
saw more of what the biases would entail. Because for a white perpetrator and a white victim, it was at 22 years, but time before parole. And for a white perpetrator and a non-white victim, it was at 14 years.
Hmm.
So it's almost like the value of life is skewed, right? The value, society values the life of a white victim higher than it would value a life of a non-white victim.
Hmm.
Um, and so
So you still see that, but that would have been what you would expect before, I guess, as well, right?
that is what would be expected. But even looking at like the sympathetic bias, we thought maybe it'll happen to the victims too, and it didn't.
Hmm. So it
So
only
that's
happens to
what we expected.
perpetrators, and
Sorry?
especially with the. I just said so. You only noticed it with the perpetrators,
Yeah.
which is the first thing that comes to mind with to me is that maybe that has something to do with the narratives of like, you know, perpetrators of minority groups or um, I guess non-white groups being kind of shown that there are situations where it's incorrectly um, sentenced or incorrectly, attributed to that person a certain crime,
Hmm.
and that's been like a very uh, common kind of thing that's been observed, especially with things like the George Floyd situation and a lot of those kind of um, stories that are getting a lot of the headline time, and yet the almost more insidious racism is still kind of there in a way. So that's a really interesting effect.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And again, it's possible, again, we're inferring implicit bias. So it's possible that there's a personalization piece, just
Hmm.
by white victims being judged,
Yeah.
the white perpetrators being judged more harshly if it's a white victim. Um,
But it's still an
but
interesting thing to note.
yes, exactly. And uh I totally lost my train of thought.
You were talking about how the less educated people tended to
Oh,
be
yes.
as well. Yeah.
Yes. So that had to relate to victim blaming.
Okay.
So what we found using the DIT, we found a correlation between those who score higher on religiosity are more likely to blame the victim for
Hmm.
what's happened,
Really?
which would be indicative of a non-moral judgment. Because again, those who score higher on the principled moral reasoning test were less likely to victim blame for the situation. And so, again, if we're inferring education based on who is religious in the study, you could infer then that there's a piece of education in there. So, not necessarily means that more educated people make more moral decisions. However, you still need that cognitive development.
And so like just I guess like a side note for the for how you operationalize. Oh my goodness, that was terrible. I was like, I should probably cut that out, but I'm not going to. So for how you operationalized it, you didn't ask for explicit mention of what a person's education was, right? You just inferred that because you're at Trinity and there's a lot of highly, the more educated population of your sample is going to be from that school and other kind of related people that who are probably going to be high in religiosity, and then people that are not high in religiosity are probably going to be those that are not from the educated population, and that's how you kind of made that conclusion.
Well, we did ask. We
You
did
did
ask
as well.
about
Okay.
education. Yeah. However, there wasn't enough information to make a specifically regarding that. But we did ask for certain levels of education. The reason why we don't have enough is because we didn't have enough people who stated they didn't have education,
Okay.
if that makes sense. So almost every person who took the study had certain level of education.
Mm-hmm.
And that had
And
a
you
lot
would need a
to do.
larger sample size of people without an education in order to
Yeah.
make a big claim like that.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
However, there is quite a few research studies out there that looks at moral reasoning and education. And again, they state that if someone has a higher level of education, they are more likely to make a principled moral reasoning decision. But again, using the additive inclusive model, that doesn't necessarily mean that in every situation that they are in, they will make those judgments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
yes.
that's really interesting.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's a really fascinating study, and I guess there's a lot of extensions to make from it, and see how it generalizes and how it works. But that is it's always interesting when you find things that are a little bit different from what you would have expected, right?
Yes, yeah. I think that's the most interesting piece of it. Finding something that's not necessarily what you thought would be.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a detour to psychopaths and psychopathy, 'cause,
For sure.
I wanted to talk about this. I always enjoy our conversations related to this, and so maybe the first thing I'll ask before we get to um, why they tend to be anomalies on the moral reasoning scale, which
Hmm.
I'm sure is fascinating as well. Why why are we so fascinated by psychopaths as a
Yeah.
society? Why are like half of the best movies ever made related to like some sort of psychopath, serial killer, crazy? And why are they so overrepresented in prison populations? And yeah, why are we so interested in them?
Yeah, that is. A wonderful question. Um, People tend to be interested in the things they don't understand,
Hmm.
but they also tend to fear the things they don't understand. So when it comes to psychopaths, most people find them very fascinating, but most people also fear them.
Probably
And
with cause, no?
uh, for sometimes, yeah, definitely. Um, but not all psychopaths are killers, and
No,
not all
but
psychopaths break the law.
most killers and most lawbreakers are psychopaths.
Not necessarily.
Well, the overrepresentation in the prison population, I was looking at it, and
Hmm.
it seems like there is, if not a majority, I think there is a majority, but if not, it's like pretty dang close to like a majority of the people, even though psychopathy is like a 2% of the population, maybe, or whatever.
Yes. Yeah, there is an overrepresentation 100%, but mostly because psychopaths are such a small percentage of the general population.
Mm-hmm.
However, most of the people in prison, although most of them get diagnosed with APD, antisocial personality disorder, wouldn't necessarily classify as a psychopath.
Oh, okay. That, yeah, explain that, because I think that's a misconception on my part. I kind of assumed that was that those kind of were mutually predictive of each other, but maybe
Yeah,
explain just the
yeah,
differences.
totally. So antisocial personality disorder is kind of like an umbrella disorder for people who violate the rights and the norms of individuals. And
Okay.
psychopathy isn't necessarily APD, mostly because psychopathy is not within the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual,
Mm-hmm.
and that classifies all mental disorders, personality disorders, anything that can be used in a court of law that could deem someone not responsible for their crime.
So
Or
psychopathy wouldn't work, but APD would.
yes, well,
Okay.
APD is normally diagnosed after someone commits a crime because it's based on behavior, not based on cognitive
But
processes.
isn't it also like diagnosed in kids who are like, who like skin animals and stuff like that? Like, isn't that kind of like one of those predictive things of like, oh, this person has a high risk factor of turning out to be APD?
Yeah. Yes and no. APD can only be diagnosed at the age of 18.
Okay.
So you cannot diagnose a child with APD. And the reason why is because
There's like a
brain
children version, right?
development, there is conduct disorder and
Conduct disorder.
defiant disorder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but can't diagnose a child with APD simply because their brain development of their frontal lobe, which is exactly what is um, the issue in antisocial personality disorder, is still developing.
Like the
So it's
executive
possible.
function part, right? So
Yeah.
they don't have that.
Memory loss inhibition, which
Yeah.
is a big piece, um, delayed gratification, um, empathy pathways, dopamine levels, all of those things are being developed. Perspective taking, theory of mind, all of those things are being developed during adolescence.
But it's
And
so
so,
complicated though. Like, you're right, but at the same time, like, it's being developed, and 18 is kind of an arbitrary age, but I guess everything has to be categorized in some way, but I don't know. That's
yeah.
just me.
And technically, it can still develop until the age of 24.
Especially in guys,
But,
right? It's a
or
little bit
25.
later, a little
Yeah.
bit
Yeah. Which
offset.
is why youth in general, it goes until the age of 24. So it doesn't stop at the age of 18, even though we're out of high school at that
Mhm.
time. And technically, you're supposed to be seen as an adult. You're still categorized as a youth
Yeah.
within
And
that.
that's why for people who are always like railing against unfair pricing against young people, it's solely to do with risk factors that are taken from economic derivatives. So don't think that you're being like targeted against. It's just science, guys. It's okay.
Exactly. It's just science. Yeah. But as a child, you would be, if you were skinning animals and setting fires, um, you would be diagnosed with something like conduct disorder,
Mhm.
which for a majority of the population, um, they develop out of it.
Yeah, I did. Actually, I'm just kidding. um, yeah. So maybe one. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe part of the misconception I have is a misconception that is actually kind of useful for the purposes of this podcast and maybe just understanding it at large.
Mhm.
Do you think maybe the APD and psychopathy in the public mind are pretty much considered the same thing. Like when people think of psychopath, they probably just think of APD, like somebody who's kind of doesn't really consider the rights of others. And
Yeah,
that, yeah, okay. I think that
definitely.
makes sense.
Definitely.
So they are overrepresented as that big population, but then within that population, psychopathy is a less understood disorder that has certain differences. Now, maybe you want to
Yes.
explain some of those
Yeah,
differences.
for sure. APD is given to almost every single person who's committed a crime,
Because
which is
they,
why it's seen as such, which is why psychopathy specifically is seen as so overrepresented. Yes, it
yeah.
is overrepresented within the criminal population, but it's mostly because the people who are psychopaths in the general population is so low.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So it's almost like you need APD to commit a crime that isn't committed, like, to save your family member or something like that. Like otherwise, you probably, if you're committing a crime where you need to like not consider the rights of others, that's like kind of implicit in most types of crimes. No, like most crimes that you would get sentenced to, you kind of need to do something that they would say that's an unreasonable thing to have done because you didn't care about this person's rights or something like that.
yeah, kind of. Yes and no. Crime is difficult. Crime is difficult. There's
Yeah,
lots of different types of theories that talk about why somebody commits a crime, because I mean, majority of the population doesn't.
which
And
is a good
why
thing,
would
right?
someone commit a crime? So, um, yeah, so there are tons of theories that talk about that. A lot of people don't commit crimes to violate the rights and norms of society. They're like, a really good example would be strain theory. That's a sociological criminology theory.
Okay.
And that one would state that if someone is in a situation where they are hungry, and they want to steal a sandwich, because they don't have the money to steal a sandwich, the benefits of stealing that sandwich outweigh the cons of getting caught.
Yeah,
So
and that's
that
just on
would
that
be an
moral
example
reasoning.
of strain.
Sorry, what? Sorry, what was it?
That would be an example of strain theory.
And on the moral reasoning scale that you presented before, that would be associated. Would that be associated with some of those levels? Like somebody who is on a high level wouldn't make that, would be less likely to make that pro con decision at a certain level.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. People who commit crimes in that area would be at a 1 or a 2.
Okay.
Most of the people who commit crimes are at a 1 or a 2.
Which is maybe why people who are highly educated and then lose their job or something still have these, you know, they don't really associate with the population. Um, well, I guess actually I can't say that because drug use can literally change your cognitive abilities, and then yeah. But anyways, well, that makes sense. That's all I'll say about that
That
because
is good.
otherwise that's a completely different tangent, and I want to stay on track with the differences between psychopathy and APD.
Yeah. And so, with APD, we have sociopathy.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that sometimes they're called, and a good way of understanding them is secondary psychopaths. And so, sociopathy is categorized under APD. Where psychopathy again is interesting. Um, and so they the difference between sociopathy and psychopathy has a lot to do with remorse. It also has a lot to do with the way that we categorize psychopaths. And so, people who are diagnosed with sociopathy, they mimic a lot of the type of behaviors that a psychopath might go through, but they also mimic a lot of the types of feelings that a psychopath might feel.
Okay.
However, a sociopath, there's some evidence that states that they can feel some remorse for what they do,
Okay.
which is one of the biggest separations because a psychopath can't.
Doesn't.
Yeah.
So people with APD, they can feel remorse. There's
So there's some evidence to state that they can,
okay.
and then again there's some that says they can't. So
So it's more ambiguous, but with psychopaths, it's dead clear that these guys can't feel any remorse.
yes. Yeah, which is why they're interesting, because they know that something is wrong, which in a lot
In
of
sociopaths know something's wrong, is what you're saying.
psychopaths,
Psychopaths know something's
they
wrong.
know that's wrong. They understand it's wrong. They don't care. They
Sociopaths
want
just
that
don't
they
know it's
want.
wrong.
Pardon?
Sociopaths don't know it's wrong,
They do know it's wrong. Psychopaths.
but
Sociopaths might not.
might not. Okay.
Might not understand why it's wrong. They might know it's wrong based on because it's against the law, but they
Mm.
might not know it's wrong, um, like at a 3 or 4 level, where they know it's wrong, so they're not going to do it, even if it was against the law or not.
So it might be that they don't see the ramifications of their actions to the same degree or
Yeah.
something. But then a psychopath is completely cognizant of the fact that, like, you know,
Yeah.
in the words of Hannibal Lecter, having an old friend for dinner
I
is
was
probably not
exactly
great.
thinking that. I mean, Hannibal Lecter, he was a very educated man. He was a therapist, which
And he's
is,
based off a real person, right?
yeah. Yeah, it is based off of it,
He's like a Mexican doctor guy, right? I think.
something like that.
I
Yeah.
can't remember his name, but yeah, he was like this psychiatrist guy who, like, yeah, crazy.
Yeah. And um one of the ways you can tell that a psychopath understands is they can mimic emotion, where sociopath can't.
Okay. And so by mimicking emotion, they're able to fit into society and largely go unnoticed, which is why you get guys like, or cases like Ted Bundy, where people were like, oh, he's such a nice guy. There's no way he could have done any of this stuff.
Yeah.
Why are we so bad at seeing psychopaths for what they are?
Because, well, one, it depends on the situation that we're in, right?
Okay.
If a psychopath has to make a decision that doesn't benefit them, they won't be able to do it. So a psychopath is very much self-serving. Most people are self-serving, but a psychopath wants what they want when they want it.
And so that's why you see associations like psychopaths being associated with higher degrees of impulsivity on like cognitive tests, but yet they are so good at weighing these pro con things that they won't kill someone if they think they're going to get caught, and they only will when they know they won't. And so, like, this is part of the maybe part of the cycle, is that they're so calculating and smart that that's why we don't notice it, because they logically think through all of the possible ramifications of, like if this person notices and then they just make sure no one does. Is that kind of what it is?
Kind of, yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of explaining it. Another reason why we don't really notice a lot of psychopaths is because we're not looking for it. Like, psychopaths spend their entire lives making it so that they're
Targets.
not noticed
They're
in
not
that way,
targets.
right? So it was interesting. I was watching a news clip of a CEO who they had to like take down a bunch of buildings or something, and he had to fire um, like 50% of the workers in that area, and tons of people lost their homes.
Okay.
And he had no, like, it didn't bug him, and because he was clinically diagnosed as a psychopath, based on people who were watching the news report, which were psychologists who watched it in class. But what was interesting about it is they slowed down the video so that you could see the way, like the teacher slowed down the video so that you could see his facial reactions. And he only reacted when the news reporter reacted in sadness. So the news reporter reacted in sadness because all of these people lost their homes, and in anger. So sadness and anger. So all of these people lost their homes. All of these people were fired. And then him as a CEO read the emotion on the face of that news reporter and then mimicked it. But it was late. So it was a late reaction. So you knew that he was mimicking the reaction of the news reporter, because it made no difference to him, but knowing that he had to mimic those reactions, he did.
That's really interesting. So it was noticeable enough that slowing it down, you could see a temporal lag compared to what a normal person
Yeah.
would exhibit.
Yeah, because he wasn't feeling those emotions.
He was replicating them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is one of the reasons why identifying a psychopath in the general population is so difficult.
Because you got to be like a super psychologist or like really good at noticing these really specific cues.
Exactly. But then also, like, people give off micro expressions of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And most people can't identify those types of emotion. They can't identify the micro expressions, but they know what a person is feeling because they've spent their entire lives trying to decode these micro expressions. But they don't know that they're doing it.
Yeah.
Psychopath has picked it apart because they have to do it.
But I suppose to a degree that really acute people who are really aware of things, of these micro facial expressions, probably have a like a sixth sense kind of notice that there's something not 100% right when someone's imitating as opposed to actually doing it. But
Yeah.
it's probably not enough of a a stimulus to make people consciously acknowledge something's off unless they're looking for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, people fall into a category of the just world belief. So people want to
People are
believe
basically good.
yeah. They
Yeah.
want to believe that we live in a good world.
Oh my
And so they're
goodness.
not going to go up to every individual being like, "Are you a psychopath?"
Yeah.
They're going to be like, "You're a nice person. Let's be friends." And then
Yeah.
something happens.
Yeah. I think it's really easy to like, this is where I think it's kind of on an educational level, people need to be exposed to things like, people should read books like, the Gulag Archipelago and stuff, just so they recognize that, like, yeah, you need to modify your schema if you think that the world is basically good, because you can get taken advantage of if that's your perception of the world. But at the same time, we can't just like go around assuming everyone's terrible. Otherwise, no one's going to trust anyone. All economic transactions aren't going to happen. It's a
Yeah.
bad catastrophe in the making.
Yeah. Well, most of our world is based on trust.
Even though a lot of times, um, it's not like everyone's going to take exactly as much as they can, right? Even non-psychopaths probably, right?
Yeah.
Because you said most people are on level 2 of the moral reasoning scale, so most of them are, as long as they know they're not going to get caught, they're like, this is as far as I can go. One step further I can't, but I'll go up to that line.
Yeah. Yeah. And most people are generally self-serving too.
Okay. So what in your studies so far of psychopathy, what's the most like misunderstood aspect of psychology, that of psychopathy, that people just always get wrong?
There's a lot. Like there's in general, I think most people are just don't understand a lot about psychopathy.
And that's why we're fascinated about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Go.
But people also fear psychopaths a lot, and it has a lot to do with the way that media portrays them.
Yeah, I mean, you got guys like like Ed Gwynn or whatever. What's that? How do you say his name? The guy who's like the other guy in the Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill is based off of that guy. I don't know.
Oh yeah,
Like the guy that like made skin suits and stuff. Like,
Ed
yeah,
Gein.
that stuff's scary. How can you not be like a little bit afraid when you're like, there was a real person that literally did this in real life?
Yeah, I mean Ed Gein wasn't a psychopath; he was mentally ill, but
Oh well, still scary.
still scary. Yeah, still
And
scary.
he gets lumped into the psychopath
Yeah,
thing as well. So
yeah, exactly. Um, I think one of the biggest things I think that people think about when they think psychopath is killer.
mm,
And the majority of psychopaths don't kill. There are they did a study on um, professions for psychopaths, and a lot of them are CEOs or business moguls. Um, Surgeons is another very common
really,
field. Yeah, because it's the recognition of having power, having control, and the recognition of when if you like save somebody's life, you are in ultimate control. right? You have done this amazing thing, and everyone is going to look at you like you are amazing.
And it
So they
takes a
take
very
more.
calculating type of person, maybe, in order to achieve that level of success, because you don't have any emotions. Then you don't have to, worry about the whims of the day to day. You can say, I get up, I work on this, I lay this brick, next brick, the next day. Doesn't matter. It's just part of a linear trajectory to the optimal goal kind of idea.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
However, almost all psychopaths will, well, it suggests that they will walk over someone to get what they want because they have no recollection of that person's emotions, right? So they have the capability to kill. Or I hold the personal belief that all people have the capability to kill.
They have a heightened
But
sensitivity to that
yes,
capability.
yeah,
Huh. So, are psychopaths necessary for the functioning of society?
probably not.
Okay.
Yeah,
That was kind of an off question, because I was like, okay, surgeons, CEOs, is it, you said it's a high percentage of, is it kind of like a helpful thing in order to achieve these degrees, or does it just happen to coincide with what most psychopaths do?
probably coincides with what most psychopaths do. I mean, it's possible that it's helpful in
Mm,
those situations. Like, I mean, CEOs and when you're in a high level business, you have to make some pretty tough decisions. And a lot of the decisions that you have to make don't benefit all parties. And so if
mm,
you can take away some people's emotions or the way that people feel out of the equation, making those types of decisions is a lot easier.
mm.
As a surgeon, people live and die all the time on your table. And if you can take away the emotion associated with death, it's probably a lot easier to do your job. So I mean, like, maybe I don't think it's necessary for society though to function.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. So when people hear things like this, like that, there's a high percentage of psychopaths in um, surgery or in CEO jobs. I think that I think people like, the somatic response to things. Like we literally respond with our gut a lot of times, and I think people will get the feeling that it somehow decreases the morality of being a CEO or being a surgeon or something, because they're so calculating. Um, I guess what I'm trying to say is I, f- I find it hard to believe that people can think of psychopaths as anything other than like a danger, like a bomb about to go off kind of idea. Do you think that there's a way we can think about psychopaths as a society, that what way do you think thinking about them will be the most kind of helpful and still avoid some of the dangers of, hey, these people can be dangerous and can make these really calculating decisions that don't fit into our code of morality, but
Yeah.
yeah, how
Yeah.
do we how do we understand them?
Well, that's hard. That's
You
hard
like
because
hold them at arm's length, or have you found you're like, I like psychopaths now that I've studied them for so long?
I find psychopathy fascinating, and I think it's super interesting. And I think most people have a general fear associated with it, and that fear is healthy, but
Mm,
I don't think that it's always rational
okay.
as well. Um, I think a good way of understanding kind of the differences between the two is that most crime in general, it doesn't happen by accident. So most crime happens based on the way that someone might grow up, based on a traumatic experience that's happened in someone's life, based on negative adverse childhood effects, or um, yeah, or something. Almost always something happens that leads to someone killing another person. And in psychopaths, that is true as well.
So minimizing the amount of like terrible experiences that people in general are exposed to will also minimize the risk of psychopaths. So it's like an additional risk factor. If you have a terrible childhood and you're a psychopath and you have mental illness, then you might have like disastrous combination that might lead to some crazy serial killer person.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And another like wide misconception with psychopaths is yes, it's a mental uh, deformity in a way or anomaly, but they um, can't be diagnosed with a mental illness either. So,
Yeah.
psychopath cannot use the DSM
Hmm.
as a way of either justifying their crime or, um, yeah, to be diagnosed with. I mean, I'm sure they could be diagnosed with something else.
Which is probably okay, don't you think? Like if a psychopath does kill someone and get to the point when it's like, hey, they're either going to prison, or we could say, hey, they're a psychopath, so they don't have to go to prison. It's like they killed someone, irregardless of whether they're psychopathy. I don't think it should be like an excuse, but maybe that's just
Yeah,
my
no, totally.
perception.
That is widely debated and argued within the academic world with
Hmm.
psychopathy and using the DSM. A lot of people say it's discriminatory towards a psychopath because, as a rights for people, everyone has the right to use the DSM.
Okay.
So some people say that it's then discriminatory. But
So
if
like,
you look at it logically as well, um, if a psychopath were to be able to use the DSM and they then killed somebody, they used the DSM and they get NCRMD, which is not criminally responsible due to a mental disorder. They get put in a mental institution. They would probably never get out of the mental institution because you're um, right now we have nothing to treat a psychopath, and a lot of people say that therapy for a psychopath is actually more detrimental for society than non-therapy for a psychopath.
that would make sense in a way if they're really good at imitating. Then therapy is only about like what your external markers of something are. They could pass every therapeutic test, be back in the world, and continue to commit atrocious crimes if they were one of the ones that got sentenced for a crime and then they were able to use DSM to kind of find a loophole.
Exactly. And so they probably would never get out of a mental institution. Whereas for prison, especially in Canada, it's different than the United States. In the United States, you can piggyback sentencing, but in
Yes.
Canada, you can't. Um, and also, life isn't really life in Canada.
How long is life in
Um,
Canada?
it's, I mean, after 25 years, you can be eligible for parole and you can get out, and technically, you can still be in life sentence because you're
Regardless,
monitored for your whole life.
regardless of what crime you committed.
Um, Regardless of what crime you committed, you can always be eligible for parole, but doesn't necessarily mean you'll get it.
So like multiple serial killers typically aren't eligible. Like they're eligible, but they typically don't get parole.
Yeah.
But they're still eligible for parole after 25 years.
I'm pretty sure. I have to actually check that. I'm not 100% sure,
Okay, yeah.
but
But it's
I'm
just
pretty
different in
sure
the
in
States.
Canada then you're always going to be eligible, whereas in the States you can get like 135 years and you
Mhm.
won't be eligible for parole until for 100
Yeah.
until 115 of them,
And like
right?
in
But Canada,
Spain, apparently they give like ridiculous sentences, like 800 years or something as
really?
well. Yeah, I just found this out the other day, where it's like they'll give you some sentence like 1100 years. It's like, okay,
Most
probably
of,
not
yeah,
probably not gonna live that one.
yeah,
One
definitely.
one thing about the DSM and finding psychopathy to be a mental disorder. I'm not sure how much research is going into this, but I do know there was one study that I looked at in one of my neuroscience courses recently, where it was it was psychopaths within prison populations that were basically the hypothesis of the theory of the uh, experiment was that there's OFC and amygdala abnormalities in psychopaths, and that those would lead to similar responses to OFC and amygdala patients on on and or sorry OFC and amygdala lesion patients on a certain study. And what that means for people who don't know is just this particular physical part of the brain. A lesion means that there's something that happened that basically killed that region or got rid of it, so it's no longer functional. So people who have not a functional amygdala tend to not have fear responses and decreased sensitivity to emotionality. And people with OFC lesions tend to be more aggressive and worse on these sort of critical reasoning in terms of risk. So one of the famous ones is the Wisconsin card task, and what they do is like you have to see how well somebody, how soon somebody recognizes that choosing from these piles that have sometimes a really big reward, but often small losses lead to a net loss, and choosing from the safer small rewards actually gives you a net gain overall. So psychopaths, the study basically showed that psychopaths were worse on this task, and that it predicts that they're similar to OFC lesion patients. And so the conclusion was maybe there is some sort of abnormalities in the OFC as well as the amygdala, for which had the amygdala study was done in a previous study that they talk about, but it's pretty well documented as well. And but there is some differences because psychopaths are more calculating, and OFC lesion patients tend to just get aggressive irrationally. But that never happens with psychopaths. They always kind of, in this study, they said they always show a calculated reason for, but they're not that good at predicting risk on some of these cognitive tasks. So I wonder if these kind of studies will lead to a neurological kind of pathology model for psychopathy, and if that will change how it's diagnosed in the future. I don't know if you've heard any of this kind of research, or if you have any thoughts
Yeah,
on something related to that.
it's super interesting. I have heard a little bit about it, read a little bit about it as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the anger response is more likely to happen in a sociopath, which is another difference between a sociopath and a psychopath.
Mm.
Um,
Like the irrational anger, you mean?
yeah, um, where psychopaths are way more likely to be cool, calm. Also, psychopaths aren't really provoked as much, where a sociopath, it can be provoked and can go off type thing. It takes a lot for a psychopath to just go off, which is another big difference between the two. And a lot of people in prison would fall under the sociopath area, or the
Mm-hmm.
or ADP in general, because it's not just
Yeah.
sociopath, it's just an umbrella. Um, I think I don't think it'll change the way that a psychopath is diagnosed, but
Okay.
it is possible that it'll change the way that a psychopath is managed.
And understood.
Yeah. Because
Mm.
again, treatment for a psychopath is hard to categorize and has a lot to do with the way in which psychopaths mimic emotion, the way that they manipulate people. The more that they understand about how emotion works, the more likely they are to be more manipulative. So, therapy in general, or like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, um, wouldn't necessarily work well for a psychopath. It would actually be more detrimental, as we were saying before. But I
Mm.
do think that managing a psychopath, being able to make it so that they don't kill a person, right? Um, those types of studies would be beneficial, to learn how to manage a psychopath, or
Mm.
a person showing psychopathic tendencies, to even a child showing psychopathic tendencies, being able to move away from that as they develop.
And perhaps understanding it better will also lead to less fear of the disorder in a sense as well.
Yeah, I don't think it would change the way that you diagnose it, though.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess diagnostic, like the DSM, tends to be more psychiatric than neurological a lot of times with some of these behavioral disorders. In that, not that there's like, I'm sure if say there was some crazy neuro marker for schizophrenia, they're not just going to ignore it and be like, nah, it's not helpful for diagnosis. But
Yeah,
at this point, it's not, right?
yeah. Well, also the brain is there's so much unknown about the brain too,
Yeah. But
right?
as we learn more, like it's almost like the Human Genome Project, right? Like I feel like as we learn more and as we map it better, it's a slow process, but like
Yeah,
conceivably in a certain period of time, we should be able to understand all these markers and maybe how they. I mean, I'm sure as a psychologist, you probably maybe disagree with me a little bit on this. I recognize how reductionist it can be.
mm,
Um, just saying like there's always some sort of neuronal explanation for something that happens. But I think like maybe if you dig deep enough, there is, just a lot of them are hidden and
Yeah.
complex as heck with like 17 different
Yeah.
variables, not 17, like 7,000. But
Yeah. No, yeah. No. I agree. I think that in general we try to um pick one or two things that kind of map out what is happening, but there's always whatever happens externally with a person, it happens in the brain. Like the brain is
Mhm.
the center of an individual, and everything that we do has something to do with the way that our brain maps, right?
Or our central
So
nervous system, at least, like your
yeah,
spine, and there's some evidence that your gut, like some neuron systems in your gut, actually are being shown to have some more kind of power. But yeah, that idea of like there's a central biological explanation for everything that we do.
yeah, yes, but it's really difficult to narrow down everything. Mostly because everybody can't just wear a brain mapping helmet around everywhere that they go, right? And so you put them in controlled settings
Yeah.
to do certain specific things to get them to do certain to get the brain to do certain specific things. But then again, there's still a general um, unknowing of a lot as well.
Yeah,
So
and I don't want to bash neural imaging techniques or anything because they're obviously amazing discoveries, and the fact that we have, and just coming up with some of these, like even PET, which was like the first one that they came up with in I think 29.
mm,
That's ridiculous to like who thought of that? Who thought of like using radioactive technologies and measuring that and how the changes in those would reflect blood flow within the brain and how that might reflect some of these different neural sections that are firing in these networks.
yeah,
But at the end of the day, they're like it's like I heard this one explanation where it's like trying to do surgery with oven mitts. So we're so handicapped at this point. Like people have these great, super expensive techniques, but they're child's play. They don't do anything in terms of like understanding exactly what happens. It's like this crazy phenomenon is related to this other thing, and that's what 20 years of research taught us. It's like great, we know that they're related now. How are they related? We have no idea. We just know they're related. So okay, thanks.
yeah.
It's great. It's just a slow and very, very slow, steady progress. So,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, no, definitely,
but it's
and it has a lot.
sorry, you just glitched out a bit there. What did you say?
Oh, it's okay. I just said it has a lot to do with how complicated the brain is and the way that we're created.
Yeah, it's like
Like
the
it's
most complex thing we know next
it's
to the
and I
universe.
mean like I'm just finished my undergrad, and I mean like I barely scratched the surface of everything that
Yeah,
has to do with human behavior. Um
yeah. But I mean, you got to do an honors degree where you got to study something in
yes.
depth, which I feel like is your first kind of step into actually getting a sense of being like a real psychologist and like really looking into this kind of
Yeah.
side of the world.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, I have another question, and then I just want to ask about what your plans are. But just before that, one last thing about psychopathy.
Mhm.
Um, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that psychopaths, it takes a lot to get them angry and to respond in kind of a uncontrolled way. Um, I heard through a study, I think it's long enough ago that I don't remember exactly which study it was and which
Yeah.
how reliable it is, but what I heard was that the one kind of thing that seems to set them off is related to a certain degree of like ego, I guess. So they feel like, if you say something like you're stupid or like not just like you're dumb, but that you miscalculated or you were like unintelligent with the way you went about this thing and like we caught you because you slipped up. That's kind of one of the things that makes them angry. Is that true? And if that is true, what would that say about the disorder?
Yeah. Um so a lot of psychologists, they're starting to examine psychopathy, and they see that a lot of psychopaths have other underlying um
Okay.
things happening as well. So there's a few different types of psychopaths then, and one type would be a narcissistic psychopath. So they have narcissistic personality disorder as well as
As psychopathy.
psychopathy, and that specifically what you're talking about would set any narcissist off.
And so that's a common combination of disorders.
Yes.
Okay.
Psychopathy and narcissism is very, very common.
I think Narcissus was a psychopath.
Maybe.
The guy, like the Greek legend is based, like the guy that looks at himself in the mirror and in the river, and then he's like, "Oh, you're so pretty," or whatever. But
definitely possible. A lot of. Sorry, I was like, I don't
know. that was like, I was trying to make a joke, I guess, but that was a little bit specific.
That's okay. It's hilarious. Very good joke.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it was good.
Yeah, a lot of narcissists actually, like a lot of people who are diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder are seen as psychopaths. But the interest of narcissistic personality disorder, there's an underlying insecurity about them, which is why when you bash their ego, they get so defensive.
Back
because
up against the wall.
The narcissistic personality is almost like you can kind of see it as a coping mechanism. It isn't, but you can kind of see it as like a coping mechanism for insecurity, as a way of understanding narcissistic personality disorder. So there's like an insecurity that kind of has an underlying thing for that. So he probably wasn't a psychopath, but maybe. I don't know.
It's possible.
Definitely possible. But yeah, those psychopaths who kind of fit within that branch of psychopathy would definitely respond probably in anger or violence with someone bashing their ego.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And those comorbidities of just different disorders happening together is something I think that's so fascinating when trying to understand these disorders, and that they don't exist in a vacuum, and they're contingent on all these other variables, which is why part of the reason why the brain is so fascinating and annoying, because you can't understand anything. There's no simple explanations ever. You're like, how do we, pick up this thing? And it's like, well, actually, we don't know. And like, come on, it's the simplest thing I could have said,
True. It's so true. Yeah. And every time you map it to, there's like different explanation every time.
It's like, this guy literally doesn't have a brain, and he's still functioning. They're like, what? I don't know. It's crazy. Okay. So I want to just ask about your plans, because you just graduated, right? Or you haven't done the ceremony or whatever, but you finished your degree. Congrats, by the way. That's huge. And so you're planning on kind of pursuing academia or a career in academia. So I'm just interested in what kind of some of the things you're thinking of in the future are, and if you have like a big thing already started, or if it's just kind of waiting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's a very good question. For anyone who ever applies to grad school, half of applying to grad school is just waiting. So, which is kind of annoying, but also totally understandable because they get so many applications. And so most of me right now is waiting and seeing where life takes me. So the ultimate plan, I would love to do forensic psychology and work in behavior analysis, and specifically looking at psychopathy and racial issues. Those are my interests, definitely. But I like the idea of past behavior predicting future behavior. And so working with police, working in high levels of government, just to understand some of the bases of crime and how people behave in the future, and to predict their next steps and what's going to happen next. For those of you who watch Criminal Minds, it's very similar, except you don't go running into gunfire. You sit at a desk and do a lot of paperwork.
Sounds safer.
It is very much safer. Yeah.
But you can still run into gunfire like once in a while, right? Just for the effect.
Just for the fun of it. Yeah.
Yeah. If you have friends, if you live in Vancouver, you got your friends in the movie business. They can
True.
hook you up. So
True. Yep. Canada is also very safe. Not a lot happens in Canada.
makes
So
me feel good.
yeah, I mean,
There are no psychopaths here.
That's not true, but
Oh dang! So close.
you almost had it. Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of like end goal, or pursuing a career in research would be another goal.
Yeah. I mean, it's always like when I think of careers in research, I always just think of like, I don't know if you ever watched The Simpsons. Probably not.
No.
But I just think of this one episode in The Simpsons where they're like feeding ducks or something, and then he throws like the food to the side, and all the grad students run, and they're like trying to get the food, and then like the professor's like, you can't have any food until you mark 10,000 papers or something. I'm like, oh, I know that that's an exaggeration, but it's definitely like, it seems like a long path before you get to like the fun stuff, and like a miserly path of like trying to pinch pennies until you got your tenure or whatever.
Oh, it's a long process for sure. Even like getting your PhD is a long process.
4 to 8 years, right?
Yeah, honestly it depends on what you decide to do your research on. If you do anything longitudinal, you're going to be taking forever to get your PhD.
So don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. Any qualitative research takes longer than quantitative research, and simply because you have to be way more thorough, and you have to operationalize everything that someone says, right? So not that it's bad research at all. Like some of the best things come out of qualitative research, and some of the things that we know today come out of qualitative research. But when you're going to do your PhD, it takes so much longer. They say to almost double the length of your degree if you're going to do qualitative research.
Because with quantitative research, it's just once you have the numbers, you plug them into statistical methods, and you have like kind of these data synthesis tools. But you have to, if it's qualitative, you have to kind of figure out exactly what each thing means on your own. Is that kind of why?
Yeah. But also, it normally, just to gather the data, takes a lot longer as well. Like, so yes, the interpretation of the data takes a lot longer because you have to see, like, are people saying the similar things? Is this the same as this? Is right? So you're inferring a lot as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Which you infer in general, because once you get your results don't actually tell you what it says. You interpret what the results are,
Yes.
and then interpret in a way of explanation of what is it saying,
which is
right?
the number one important like thing to remember, and something that's often a misnomer with like the really scientifically minded people.
Yeah.
I think like the social sciences sometimes get bashed as not being like as rigorous in their understanding of something, because they say like, we're making associations, and we're not like, I don't know. I guess it's a lot easier when you just show someone a bunch of numbers and then say, this is what it means. They'll be like, yeah, you're right. But if you tell them like, this is what we got, and we got it through these methods, and even someone who's not an expert might feel like they can, I want to dig into this a little bit more. Than sometimes with the numbers, it's just, I don't know, it's like an extra bit of prestige, or a bit of people feel like they're untouchable because they have this proof or something.
Yeah.
Literally, like you said, both are inferring in the same way a lot of times.
Yeah. But also, like, going back to like social sciences, human behavior in general is complex. There's so many explanations for anything that could happen, right? So even if we get like a correlation between two things, we can never say that this causes another thing, because human behavior in general is just so broad and vague. So it's hard to say this is it. Instead, this is a possibility, but this is also a possibility, and this is also a possibility,
And that's the most important thing with an undergrad and I sometimes I think certain subjects don't do this as well, but they need to be, if it's a scientific subject, rigorous with explaining, and that you can't just interpret things because based off of your feelings. Like, in the last few years, like, I've read some published articles. It's like, this is just a person's opinion. Like, they could just go onto like a blog and put this on. Like, this is just their opinion on something. There's no kind of ability of thinking outside of their own schema and thinking maybe there's another explanation for it, or
Right.
maybe I'm not understanding the data the right way, which I don't know. This is why you get the celebrity academics a lot of times, right? Where they just interpret whatever the data in however way fits their narrative. And that's not what it's about, right? When you're studying this, you're going to just be looking at data and trying to be as unemotional, as psychopathic in your in your analysis as possible.
It's true. It's true. And honestly, if you can remove the emotion associated with it, um, you get really interesting results. Like if you were just trying to confirm exactly what you want to see in the
Mm,
results that you're getting, then you're not going to find anything meaningful, you know?
yeah.
Like if we were to do that for like my thesis, we would try to confirm that people uh, judge non-white perpetrators more than they judge white perpetrators. But then we wouldn't have ever found the sympathetic bias effect, right? Where this is a possibility. This is a possible explanation for why the white perpetrators are being judged more harshly than non-white perpetrators,
Hmm.
right?
And if
Um,
you hadn't opened up that as a possibility, you would have just said, "Oh, something wrong with the data because I know that that isn't true." But that's just your gut feeling telling you it isn't true, and then you're fitting the data to that, which is so backwards.
exactly, exactly. And we ended up getting really meaningful data that I think, especially for what's going on in the world right now, like even with COVID-19, the racism and discrimination rates have like almost, I think it was almost tripled.
Mm.
And so,
Is that in reporting?
yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I'm not
Which is
100% sure.
also hard
I
enough
know
because
about
people make an inference that there's been an increase in reporting represents an increase in it happening, right? Like with our increased, you could say like, oh, there's higher depression rates or something, and it's like,
yeah,
well, no, there's higher rates of diagnosing depression because we're getting better tools at diagnosing it,
yeah, yeah,
right? They're very
exactly.
different things.
Yeah. Um, yes, it was in reporting. I was just looking back at my notes.
Sweet. It's like
Um, forgot.
the joke, classic joke. It's like you ask a statistician what and they'll just say like, what do you want it to say, kind of idea, you know.
Hmm.
So it's true, it can be misinterpreted a lot of different ways depending on which outliers you get rid of and what you try to fit the data to.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's all interesting stuff, and research in general is really cool and really interesting, and it adds a lot to what's already out there. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
so yeah.
That's super fascinating. Well, thank you so much for talking with me about psychopathy, about your research, and where you're potentially going so far. Um, I just have one last question that I ask everyone. It's kind of unrelated to psychopathy.
Cool.
So the whole kind of idea of this podcast is tangential to stories because I've always been fascinated with it as kind of a both anthropomorphic and just human underpinning to everything that we understand things through stories, and I think this fits well into both a scientific frame as well as kind of an artistic framework, which I've always been interested in the synthesis of them.
Mhm.
So the question I have about this is just if you could tell one story or have one kind of message that would get through all the noise and really kind of connect with people, what would that be? And it can be something general or something specific. It obviously people might have more than one, but just one thing that you kind of wish you could get through to people, and maybe through your experience in psychology or other parts of your life as well.
Yeah. Oh my.
It's kind of a hard question for sure.
That's a big one. Um, I'll have to go back to your podcast and listen to what everyone else said.
Yeah.
Um, um, I think now going back to like my interests and my research, what I've done, um, I think one of the biggest things that society falls into a lot is that they don't try to understand crime. So again, we talked about like the just world belief and how people believe that the world is a good place, and so when someone does something wrong, they just believe that they're a monster.
Mm,
And I think like that mentality surrounding things can be really dangerous,
mm,
especially for offenders and perpetrators who um, do something and are trying to be rehabilitated and change and um, they don't really give the room to do that. Now, again, fear is healthy, but understanding that crime doesn't happen by accident, and by understanding crime, we can understand some of the most dangerous people in society. And if we can understand those people, maybe we can help them.
Hmm.
I think that would be like the biggest thing for me to get across to other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an important message, especially kind of in line with what you were saying with your research and how you found it too, as well, that we need to be willing to try to understand people and not to just say, this is what I think, and I'm only going to acknowledge confirmation bias type stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stuff that fits into my narrative,
Exactly.
how I understand the world. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and man, I know most of the ones up till now have been kind of artists, but now I'm like, oh man, I just want to get more academics on to talk about those kind of topics. They're super interesting as well.
Yeah. No, this was super fun. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 12 of At the Base of the Baobab Tree. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and that you'll come back soon and listen to episode 13. Have a good one.